Will do, Meg.
Thank you. Okay, so everyone welcome. This is the Assembly Committee on Housing and Homelessness, March 17, 2021. I'll call the meeting to order, and Travis, can you please call the roll?
Yes. Miss Allard. Mr. Constant.
He is excused.
Mr. Dunbar. Miss Kennedy.
Here.
Miss LaFrance. Mr. Perez Verdia. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
And Miss Altel.
Here. Thank you so much. And I did receive a note from Ms. LaFrance that she'd be unable to join us today as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to just run through the agenda really quick and we'll get it going. First will be initial audience participation. We have one participant. And then we've got 4 presentations and then our standing items for the legislative and budget priorities. Our second audience participation, committee discussion and adjournment. I wanted to check if Mike Edgington is on the line with us. He's requested initial audience participation to update us on what Girdwood is doing with regard to homelessness. Are you with us, Mr. Edgington? If you're on the phone, it's *6, I believe, to unmute. I'm not hearing you if you are on. What I will do, note for the record, Mr. Dunbar has joined us. I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just get started. We hear from Mr. Edgington. I will slate him first and make sure we have time in the second audience participation for him to present the information he wanted to share with us. So I'll just kick us over into item number 4, our business. And the first step is an ADU presentation from Sightline. I'm really happy to welcome them to provide this presentation. As we all know, this committee's name recently changed from Committee on Homelessness to Committee on Housing and Homelessness. And I'm excited to make sure we have one item that is always keeping us focused on housing. So I'll ask, if you're not presenting, if you can please mute. And with that, I will turn it over to Sightline to introduce themselves. And you may share your screen for your presentation, which has been shared on the committee's website. Thank you so much. Great, we can see the presentation. Oh. And I don't know if, there we go.
Okay, can you see that?
I can see it and I can hear you.
Okay,
Please.
Great, sorry. Let me just start the slideshow here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. Let me just get this set up. Okay, sorry about that. So thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Meg, for inviting us. I'm Jeanette Lee. I'm a senior researcher at Sightline Institute, and my pronouns are she, her, and I live and work on the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina here in Anchorage. I'm here with my colleague Nizma Gabobe. She has a lot of experience working on ADUs at the state and local levels in Washington State, and will be leading the second half of our presentation. So, Sightline is a public policy think tank focused on Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. we do research and publish articles on 4 main program areas. They are housing, transportation, the environment, and democracy. Here in Alaska, we focus on local housing issues and statewide democracy issues. On our housing work, we help create the policy environments necessary to build sustainable cities that are highly walkable and bikeable and where everyone has access to quality housing they can afford. One way to achieve these goals, we have found, is through simple zoning changes that allow more housing of all shapes and sizes for all members of a community. One housing type we study that helps achieve this is the accessory dwelling unit, or ADU. An ADU is simply a secondary housing unit that shares a lot with a larger main house. You may also know them as in-law apartments, above garage suites, or backyard cottages. Nisva and I recently wrote an article about the Assembly's 2018 ordinance, which loosened some of the restrictions on property owners wishing to build ADUs. And we also looked at what the city can do in the future to improve ADU policy even more. And these are some examples of the above garage ADU type in the Anchorage Bowl. So the question of why we should build more ADUs may generate different answers in different communities. We've been talking a little bit about with Girdwood because they're working on an update to their ADU code with an eye on certain benefits specific to them. In our article, we focus on the Anchorage Bowl and identified the following benefits, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So keeping more Alaskans in Alaska. For several years, Alaska's economy has been weak relative to the lower 48, which was booming pre-pandemic, if we can even remember that time, making it harder to attract new residents and keep people here. As a result, Anchorage's population has been shrinking each year for the past 6 years. One way to counteract this trend is through building more reasonably priced housing in desirable neighborhoods. For example, you can help seniors stay here longer rather than moving out of state, because with an ADU, they can easily downsize on their own property or move in with family. ADUs also attract millennials and Gen Zers who tend to value proximity to work, trails, and other amenities over square footage. ADUs can also increase access to desirable neighborhoods. They're more affordable, meaning you can also enable more of an income mix in neighborhoods. Young families and students can be close to jobs and good schools, and you can do this with a minimal impact to a neighborhood's look and feel, which is very appealing to a lot of people. And while ADU reform should not be sold as a key homelessness reduction strategy, we do know that adding housing supply keeps average rents from getting out of hand. And we also know that increases in rent correlate with increases in homelessness. So in that light, ADUs can be seen as a modest preventative measure for housing insecurity and homelessness. And unlike many measures to address these issues, ADU code reform doesn't typically require a big spend for cities. They also help the finances of both homeowners and renters. They offer the happy paradox of increasing property values while also helping to keep rents under control. For owners, that you get more square footage, which equals higher assessed value and rental income that can help pay the mortgage. For renters, more housing boosts supply and competition among landlords, particularly if the ADUs are added to the long-term rental market or are even offered to family members for free. Other upsides, which were noted in the Assembly's Adu Ordinance in 2018, they provide more options for residential expansion in the Anchorage Bowl. And because they're smaller, they tend to be less expensive to heat and maintain than traditional detached houses. So here are some statistics. The city estimates there are at least 1,000 attached and detached ADUs in Anchorage from Chugiak to Girdwood. And that's only about 2% of the single detached homes in the municipality. They appear in a variety of neighborhoods from Stuckagen Heights and the Lower Hillside to clusters closer to downtown like Inlet View and Midtown, including Rogers Park. ADUs are hard to accurately count in Anchorage. About 600 are on record here in the municipal property appraisal database. And according to Chris, Shooty, there are likely another 400 or so that have not been permitted. And I don't know if that number's changed since we spoke about it. It's possible, I guess. Let's see. So in our article, we noted that the ADU ordinance passed by the Assembly in 2018 included several improvements, and we'd like to just call out the ones we thought were particularly effective based on what we've seen in other cities. So one, the big one, both ADU types, the attached ADU and detached ADUs, are now allowed in all zones. And the current code says detached ADUs no longer need to be part of a garage, like the ones you saw in that earlier slide. So that's a nice improvement. Another improvement, one parking space is required per ADU, which is not a change, I believe, but now the city traffic engineer may allow it to be on street. And that's a big deal since the need to build a parking spot on site can kill a project for a variety of reasons. Another improvement was that any number of related people or no more than 5 unrelated people can now live in an ADU where previously only 2 people could live in one. And that change is definitely helpful for families. Excuse me. We actually also have a table comparing the old and new codes in our article, and I encourage you to look at that because there's a lot of detail in there, and we don't have enough time in the presentation to go through them all. Sorry. Okay, so the effects of the ADU ordinance, you may be wondering about what happened since 2018. The best data on ADU activities since the ordinance passed comes from the tally of affidavits property owners must file if they intend to build one. These affidavits state that the owner will be a resident on the property where the ADU is located, either in the principal dwelling unit or in the ADU itself. The affidavits filed with the city rose slightly after the ordinance passed. So from 2013 to 2017, an average of 17 affidavits were filed each year with the city. Since the ordinance passed, an average of 24 have been filed per year. While these numbers suggest a modest improvement following passage of the ordinance, the available data can't confirm a causal relationship, and there may be other factors at work that led to that increase. We just don't know. The ordinance did loosen some restrictions and brought increased awareness of how ADU construction can help more people access reasonably priced housing. We do know that for sure. And who knows, maybe it will lead the way to more changes that make it easier for homeowners and developers to add ADUs. Now I'm going to pass it over to Nizma, who's going to talk about this in more detail and also show you other cities and states where ADUs have been growing in popularity.
Yes, hello everyone. Jeanette, is my audio coming through okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks. This is my first time using this headset. Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Nisma Kapobe. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior research associate at Sightline. I live and work on traditional Duwamish land. And I also want to thank the committee for inviting us to speak today. And so, like Jeanette said, I'm going to go over some potential next steps that Anchorage could explore to encourage more ADU homes and just briefly touch on what we covered in our article. And a lot of this, particularly the code recommendations, are based on research we've done in other cities. So I imagine there may be some differences in how you may want to approach these issues locally. And I'll also talk about how some ADU reforms have played out in other places on the West Coast. So 2 of the largest regulatory barriers that we see in other jurisdictions are owner occupancy requirements and parking requirements. Owner occupancy rules bar renters from living in one of the units and remove a potential home from the rental market. They could also be pretty inflexible towards owners who may have to leave home to care for a family member or pursue a job opportunity for a few years. And so that limitation can discourage owners from wanting to build an ADU. And it's a rule that doesn't apply to any other housing type. This is something cities place uniquely on ADUs. Excessive parking requirements can make it difficult to to meet those requirements with smaller lots, and can place additional costs and time to add a paved parking space that may not necessarily be needed. I know that Anchorage has procedures in place for exemptions for that requirement, which definitely helps. But also just those add more steps for owners to, navigate throughout the permitting process. And especially for like lower income and middle income owners, we want to make that process as easy to navigate as possible. And so a simpler way to address this issue would be to remove the requirement and allow owners to decide whether they actually need that parking space or not, or if there are, existing site-specific, areas that would fulfill the parking needs. Excessive code requirements are not the only barriers to ADUs. Financing is also a major issue for lower and middle income homeowners. So localities can help support owners that are looking to build ADUs by offering grants or loans, or waiving some of the city fees, like impact fees and permitting fees. So there are different approaches that you could take, different levels to which the city can, actually help support that, ADU construction financially. So one example of an ADU financing program in Alaska is in Juneau, which started a pilot financing program a few years ago, where they offered 12 owners a very small $6,000 grant to help them get started on building an ADU. And this came out to be about 11% of costs on average for ADUs in that program. Of course, if the locality puts substantial, funding into this, they could then require the ADU to be regulated affordable housing. People who may be interested in building an ADU may not know much about the process, so localities can offer information sessions, can make information about, about ADUs and the permitting process, financing options available publicly on your websites in kind of a centralized resource. And yeah, just find ways to kind of educate the community on how they can navigate this process and build their own ADUs. And to encourage ADUs outside of, just single family zones, you could also allow ADUs with duplexes, for example. California allows ADUs on some multifamily lots, so a duplex could have an ADU. And in Vancouver, BC, they allow each duplex unit to have an ADU. So those are some ways you can also see ADU construction outside of just single family neighborhoods. After enacting one of the most progressive ADU reforms of any major city in the US in 2019, Seattle saw significant increases in ADU permit applications. And this was a pretty comprehensive reform that included things like removing owner occupancy and parking requirements, and even allowing 2 ADUs on a lot. And this chart shows that the city accepted 227 applications in 2018 and 566 applications in 2020. So they saw a huge difference afterwards. And this dynamic is, we also see it in other places that took on comprehensive ADU reforms. So in Portland, they saw ADU permits really increase after their 2010 reforms. And the biggest or most significant part of that reform was to waive a systems development charge, which is what they refer to as their impact and utility fees. And after that, they saw a huge difference in permits issued in the city. And you could see that there's been kind of a drop-off in recent years, particularly in 2019. And in our discussions with local builders, they kind of speculate that this might be due to a new impact fee on short-term rentals, and also because the SDC waiver was made permanent, so there's maybe not as much urgency to take advantage of that. And in California, they've been working on statewide ADU reform since 2016 and have kind of been steadily addressing that issue. And in 2019, really started to see the impacts of that work with a huge jump in permits from almost 6,000 in 2018 to nearly 16,000 in 2019. And those reforms included things like speeding up the permitting process for ADUs, waiving impact fees for smaller ADUs, capping or waiving parking requirements depending on proximity to transit, limiting utility fees. So they've done a lot of work to address ADU barriers at the state level, and they're starting to see that pay off. And lastly, I want to mention Vancouver because they've been a real model for ADU ordinances in the Northwest since they began addressing these code barriers in the 90s. And now we see that 1 in 3 single detached houses in Vancouver has an ADU. And so this is, the examples I've got over here are really a small snapshot of the ADU reforms we've seen and the broader zoning reforms we've seen, particularly around middle housing. There's a lot more action among cities and states to expand housing options across our cities. And, as the housing crisis worsens, addressing our zoning rules and opening up neighborhoods to different housing types that can be offered at different price points is a first, but we think a really important step in addressing our housing crisis. And so we are happy to work with the committee and the assembly on, any proposals you may consider around this, as this has been a pretty significant focus of Sightlights housing work in recent years. So we're happy to be a resource to you all. And yeah, I'll end there, and we're happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you both so much. I need to note for the record at 11:10, we were joined by Ms. Allard. If you have any questions, please hop in the queue while we have these two individuals with us. Again, the presentation is up on the website. Mr. Weddleton, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for this. You make good points, and pretty much all of them we kicked around when we made the changes in 2018. And part of, we didn't just open the doors 100% wide because we wanted to see how it went and the impacts of it. Because, to particularly taking a R1, single family home on a lot, and now allowing more than one home on a lot, that's pretty significant. And we had a lot of, I think, legitimate concern about that. Since then, I haven't heard a whole lot, but what I've heard were with a few instances where people built ADUs that neighbors felt kind of loomed over their lot and blocked their views and so on. So, typically when people are happy, you don't hear from them. When they're upset, you do. So it could be that many of the new ones are perfect and there was just a few bad ones. But, someone you say, that you can do this and have a minimal impact on the neighborhood, look and feel. It can also have a pretty dramatic change. And if you get rid of parking, the reality is in Anchorage, you're pretty much close to the truth. Every single person drives a car on every single place they go at any time. That's the sad reality. We're trying to build a world where people can bike and walk. But right now in Anchorage, we all drive every single time we go anywhere. And if we don't make a place for people to park, if you make one, typically an ADU, if they have 2 people, they'll have 2 or 3 cars. It's just the reality. And where are you going to put them? And you will dramatically change the neighborhood if all of those have to find a place on the street. So, and we had that big discussion, and I think that's why we ended up saying, give us one for the ADUs. And I don't know if you can show me something that shows that's wrong thinking. I'd be glad to see it. I'd love to see it, but that's what I witness as reality. I live in a fairly tight neighborhood. And I just see how many cars every single unit has. It is just shocking. I mean, there's 3 people in my house. There's 3 cars. I have a neighbor. They've got like 6 people in there. They have 7 cars. So you can't ignore that. And then the other thing is you mentioned that they dropped in Portland when they increased the short-term rental fee, and I think that's what happens with these things. Airbnb, I mean, that's the moneymaker here. So you put them in and you put them on Airbnb, which doesn't really help the housing market. And I know if you've been talking to Girdwood, that's a very big issue with them, is that half the people don't live there, but they rent them out in Airbnb, and you get a fairly small unit attracts a lot of people and a lot of cars. So again, you have the car issue, but it also changes the nature of the neighborhood. And then a third point is when you don't have owner occupancy in a neighborhood, particularly, R1, you have single family homes. Those are generally owned, the owner lives in them. And when you get to a neighborhood that has more renters, it absolutely changes the nature of the neighborhood. There's just less buy-in to the neighborhood. And if you don't have owner occupancy, then you have 2 rentals on that property, which might have been a owner occupied, R1 single family home. So, but those were points that we discussed fairly extensively when we made the changes before. So we kind of sat tight. And I mean, I think it's obvious you build more if you got those restraints, but you would impact neighborhoods. So anyway, you're welcome to prove me wrong. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for your comments. And Jeanette, feel free to jump in here whenever. Okay, let me kind of go back here. So first off, I just want to acknowledge that we've been working in other cities in the Northwest, and the needs of Anchorage and might be different, and so I don't necessarily have that local perspective. But in terms of parking requirements, I mean, first, just want to acknowledge that this doesn't mean that they couldn't add a parking space on with the unit. They could do that if they deemed that necessary, if that there wasn't an actual requirement for them to do so. But I think it would be really helpful to understand, to have some sort of like study of parking needs and parking availability in the city before kind of making that decision. When Seattle was considering our ADU reforms, they looked into that when they were kind of going through the environmental assessments, tried to understand, what the parking needs were in Seattle neighborhoods, and they came to the conclusion that their ADU proposal would not significantly, impact, and removing the parking requirement would not significantly impact neighborhoods because there was enough on-street parking availability. So I think maybe doing something similar for Anchorage could be helpful, just to understand, what the parking needs are across your neighborhoods before making that decision, or reconsidering that decision. And to go back to Portland, yes, they did see, like you rightfully point out, they did see that drop with the new short-term rental fee, but they still they had permits in the 300 and something, which is much higher than what they were seeing before they enacted any reforms. Don't think they had hit even 100 permits per year at that point. So there are still a considerable number of ADUs coming in that weren't short-term rentals. And I guess kind of further how with the owner occupancy requirement, as that kind of comes into the short-term rental conversation, we really have recommended in the past that cities enact sort of separate short-term rental policies where they cap the short-term rentals that they want per lot, or kind of address that issue separately so that you're not using owner occupancy to ban renters from living on one of the properties, because that affects long-term rentals as well. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. Sorry, that was kind of a long comment.
No,
I'll
great.
just add some local perspective, very personal local perspective. You know, I live in a fairly uptight neighborhood with an HOA that's pretty on point here in Sand Lake, and we have 2 rentals in our cul-de-sac. They're both single-family homes, no ADUs. They're absentee owners renting out their homes, and the neighbors, the people living in them, have been great. And if we ever opened up our neighborhood to ADUs, I don't know if that would happen, but you know, in the future, if we did, it means these particular owners would be out of the running to build them, even though there's plenty of space to do so, both in terms of parking and in terms of their lot size. So, I mean, just eyeballing it anyway. So, something to think about.
Well, great. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I think it is something for us to think about as we look at overall housing strategies and affordable housing issues, and how that ties with the availability for housing around issues of homelessness. So I really appreciate the presentation. We're going to hop back in our agenda and give Mr. Edgington a chance to speak because he cannot stay until final audience participation and he had signed up. Mr. Edgington, are you with us? It's *6 to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, excellent.
And you're speaking today on behalf of the Girdwood Board of Supervisors, is that correct?
I'm speaking as a member of the Girdwood Board of Supervisors. I'm speaking on my own behalf. I haven't approved this. This hasn't been an approved statement, but I just want to describe some work we're doing in Girdwood. So yes, my name is Mike Edgington. I'm an elected supervisor for the Girdwood Board of Supervisors. My area of responsibility is land use, and I also run a couple of other committees, including the Housing Working Group. And I just wanted to briefly introduce the work we're doing. And I do intend to be attending more of these assembly committees in the future because it's very interesting to me. As you're probably aware, Girdwood is a physically separate community. We have approximately 1,800 people living here. So we represent under 1% of the municipality's population. We have a related and distinct set of housing issues. Affordability is a huge topic here. I think there is a misunderstanding from outside of the community that Girdwood is just a community of sort of the affluence. There is absolutely a lot of that here, but we kind of have a bimodal distribution in terms of economics. There's most of the employment here is in the service and tourism industry with fairly low wages. And housing, unfortunately, does not match that distribution very well. Housing costs are extremely high. The other thing that makes it quite different from the rest of Anchorage is the dark home problem we have here. So we have about 1,400 housing units, and single-family homes are about 40% owner-occupied. Condos are about 9 to 10% owner-occupied. The rest is a small long-term housing market. There is a very large number of empty houses, and there's also a pretty large short-term rental market. That's really supplanted the long-term rentals, and particularly people who aren't able to sort of move into home ownership have had a terrible problem actually staying in this community. So the main issues we're looking at are trying to look at ways we can increase the supply of housing, improving the way we use the existing housing stock. I said ADUs are part of that, and I was prompted to come to this meeting in part because of previous discussions with Jeanette and Nisma, and it's great to hear their presentation again. The other area that we have an acute problem here is in short-term rentals, which has been mentioned again a few times. I said we have about 1,400 housing units. At least 250 of those are involved in the short-term rental market. So you can see it's a significant part of our housing stock is involved in that. The other issue we have, which I think is probably a little different from the rest of Anchorage, which is really something we've seen in the last year, is what's referred to, I think, in the planning world as amenity migration. So we've had an increasing number of people who've now that a lot of white collar work can be done remotely. People have moved to this community to who work elsewhere in the state or elsewhere in the U.S. Remotely, and they choose to live in this resort community because of the environment. And that's put additional pressure on housing. In fact, I think the estimates I've seen are housing cost has probably increased, at least for purchase, around the sort of 25 to 40% mark over the last 18 months. One more issue we have is being a neighborhood of Anchorage rather than a sort of city or entity on our own behalf. We have a real paucity of data. It's very hard to get useful, meaningful data for this community. So I use what I can to do analysis, but it's hard to make data-driven policy decisions. And my very last point is, an Assembly Member Weddleton earlier mentioned that everybody drives everywhere in Anchorage. I should say that Girdwood is part of Anchorage, and we have a significant number of people who do not drive everywhere. So one of my other activities is to look at the parking rules, which we have in land use here, and we identify that the parking requirements, at least as applied to Girdwood, are rather excessive. So we're scaling that down because we actually have a lot of people walking, skiing, riding, because we're such a compact community with a relatively low population. That's obviously not true for people coming into the community for tourism and visitors, but it's true for the resident population. Anyway, I just want to introduce what we're doing, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. It's very good to get your perspective and that you bring us up to date on what's happening in Girdwood and the challenges you're facing, because I think we need to be looking municipality-wide. So thank you so much for your time and joining us today. We are going to continue to move forward with the agenda. We have a few other items to cover today. Next up is an update from Parks and Recreation on healthy spaces. As you all know, this is a standing item on the agenda just to hear how the Healthy Spaces Initiative is rolling out from month to month. Mr. Durand, are you with us? Or is there anyone else from the administration that could give a brief update? Okay, well, hopefully someone can join us and we can circle back. Number 3 on the agenda is the rapid rehousing update. The Assembly had appropriated $1 million of CARES Act funds to rapid rehousing, and we've had some questions about how that went and the status of that, and we're hoping to get an update today. Is there someone prepared to do that? So there's no one, this has been a request that had been put out to get an update on the deployment of the rapid rehousing dollars that had been appropriated by the Assembly. Is there any update that can be provided? If not, we'll move on to the last item. Okay, Travis, can you go ahead and put the draft resolution up, please?
Pulling that up right now.
Thank you. This is a draft resolution prepared by me and our Vice Chair Constant. As you know, the body has had a lot of conversations around transitioning or what's going to happen as the emergency winds down and we transition out of the emergency posture. We wanted to bring this resolution forward to this committee. It's really a resolution asking that the Assembly be updated on the creation of a transition plan as it relates to congregate and non-congregate shelter. We've just referred to both those items as mass shelter. And then once that plan for demobilization is provided, that this body continues to get progress on the implementation of the demobilization plan as a standing item in this committee. We want to be sure that the Assembly is fully looped in for a couple of reasons. One, we currently have nearly 800 individuals in shelter. And we know that our pre-COVID shelter capacity was greater than the current utilization rate. Two, I know the members have expressed some concerns, and we want to ensure that the demobilization plan around the Sullivan Arena doesn't result in considerable unsheltered individuals in camps. And three, we do know that right now, mass shelter will be covered by FEMA until September 30th, 2021. So we do have a deadline, and we're aware of how expensive the mass shelter is in terms of the Sullivan Arena in particular through our updates. So we wanted to put this resolution before the committee and members who are at the committee today for discussion, if there should be anything else included, if we think the resolution is needed, not needed, we need to go another route, but we need to, it's my opinion, and I believe Mr. Constance, that we need to be fully apprised of what's happening as we move through the next, I guess, about 6 months. So I want to open this up for discussion. Please hop in the queue. If you have anything you would like to add or any suggested edits or additional things with regard to this topic, it's my hope that we can move this resolution after we have discussions here into hopefully the addendum on Friday, unless there are significant changes that are requested. Or even if there are, I can probably get them done. So I'm going to open it up for discussion. And if there is no discussion, then, we'll probably move forward with a very close version of this draft here into the addendum for next week's meeting. Mr. Weddleton, please go ahead.
Oh, thanks. So I wonder, I think, we've heard pieces of this from the administration, so they're obviously thinking about this too, but have you had conversations with any of the providers and their intent on getting closer to their previous capacity? I think that was a key element in the administration's plan.
I believe those conversations are ongoing between the administration, the EOC, and providers, and so that's why we've requested some time between putting this resolution out, and I believe April 7th was the date that I put in here to get that demobilization plan. It's my understanding that all those conversations are happening now, but I just want to ensure that we have an opportunity to know what the plan is when it's created.
Sure. No, I think the goal is really good. Thanks.
I see a hand up, and I apologize. I can't tell whose hand it is, but I'm going to figure that out. Mr. Peterson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I was just wondering if Robin Ward or the people in the Heritage Land Bank have found any more buildings that they think might be suitable for a shelter, so that we could move out of the Sullivan Arena and get that back to a sports venue. Just wondered if there's an update available from them. Thanks.
Is there anyone from the administration who can address Mr. Peterson's question?
Hi, Assembly members, Alatal. This is Katie Skovic, Communications Director in the Mayor's Office. I think on this and your last question for the administration, I don't know that I'm equipped to provide an answer at the moment, but I'm taking notes and can, at the very least, commit to getting you responses from our end.
Wonderful, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Peter.
That would be fine. That would be fine. Thanks.
I believe Ms. Harris, Health Department Director, excuse me, Heather Harris had her hand up. Please go ahead, Ms. Harris.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to comment. I think as we looked at the resolution here at the Health Department recently, one request that I would have is just a consideration of number 2, that the demobilization plan would be provided to the Assembly no later than April 7th. I haven't had the opportunity yet to connect with the EOC team or the administration to determine what a strong timeline could be that we could come through on. I am concerned that April 7th might be a little bit quick. These conversations are absolutely in the works right now and are working towards developing what a demobilization plan might look like, but I'm concerned about that timeline in particular.
Thank you for providing that feedback. Yeah, it was a bit of a stab, but I think I wanted to put a date out there so we could start to have we get that feedback about that date. So the addendum deadline is noon on Friday. So if the administration wants to get back in touch on a deadline that it's comfortable with, we can assess that, or we can have that conversation about the resolution if it comes before the body on Tuesday. Is there any additional discussion about the proposed resolution? Okay. Thank you for sharing the document on the screen, Travis. I'm going to turn now then to the next item on our agenda, and that is committee legislative and budget priorities, in particular first quarter budget revisions. Per the chair's request, I sent in with Mr. Constant, not specific itemized dollar budget revision requests, but really items related to the transition in ensuring that we can decompress the Sullivan Arena and the non-congregate shelters with the FEMA funding deadline, and whether or not that would require any first quarter budget revisions. I haven't received anything specific back from the administration in terms of that, but that was the priority we put forward, was to ensure that there was adequate funding for the transition plan. I know there's an outstanding issue around case management and FEMA reimbursement, and then the coordination of those other funding sources we've talked about in previous committee meetings around emergency solutions grants and community development block grant funds. But if there are any other first quarter budget requests that members are thinking about related to housing and homelessness, I would invite you to share them now if you're willing and have the capacity to do so, or if you think something else should be put on the radar in those terms, so that we can make sure that both the chair and the administration have them. So this is an opportunity, if you have anything you'd like to share, to please do so. Mr. Weddleton, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. It's not specifically housing and homelessness, but it's mostly is Girdwood is doing a area plan that is fairly far along, and they're looking for $25,000 to finish that. And a huge part of that plan is, as Mike Edgington spoke to, is providing more housing in Girdwood. That's their number one issue there. So if you want to add that to the list for this committee, that would be nice. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Especially as we know that I don't believe there are currently any shelter services, and we of course want to preserve all the housing that we certainly can as a preventative measure around homelessness. So yes, I will do that, Mr. Weddleton. Thank you. Anything else around first quarter budget revisions? Okay, not seeing or hearing anyone. We will turn now to audience participation. For those who wish to participate, you'll have 3 minutes to speak. If you are on the phone, you'll have to hit *6 to unmute, and I'll take on a first come, first served basis. So whoever would like to speak.
I'd like to speak.
Okay, Mr. Oliva, I hear you. You are first. Please go ahead.
Well, I'm very concerned of the rezoning of B3 property to homeless shelter and transit housing. It was amazing that even the last stop on Carlick Street, if you watch that YouTube video, 4,000 parcels to be reclassified and not to notify those property owners is totally wrong. And when the senior planner says he knows nothing of homeless issues in his testimony at planning and zoning, but he will rezone 4,000 parcels and recommend it for homeless housing. That doesn't make any intelligent sense. So what you're going to do is going to polarize the city with this rezoning by not letting those property owners aware of what's coming down the pike. You do not have safeguards in place, including what you call the conditional use, because code enforcement over the 40 years that I've been next to the shelter never enforced one of the conditional uses. And when they went out to see if there was any negative impacts to the neighborhood, it was a consent agenda item that could not be refuted, including my lawsuits and 10,000 calls a year, which I think was germane and relevant to a negative impact of a homeless shelter next to I-2 property. And now you're going to bring them to B3. We already feel the effects of the moving from the shelter to the guest house, which has now been renamed the Death House on Fifth Avenue, and the Holiday Inn, the overflow from that has just been negative. So your safeguards are not in place. And should the chairman say he's looking forward to a robust discussion on this rezone, I think you're looking at major class action lawsuits by the owners of B3 property and further dividing the city on the issue of homelessness and the solutions. So I'm taken aback knowing that I have my own exit plan, but unfortunately, when you watch the last stop on Carlick Street, the mess was on private property, the public property that I adopted and cleaned up. And my conviction of using a pest. Is my 3 minutes up?
Yes, it is. Thank you for your testimony or for your participation today.
Meg, do you have any questions? Show me that decency. I'm not on a video.
I'm sorry, there are no questions at this time. Thank you for your participation.
Well, your minds are made up and don't confuse yourself.
Okay, would anyone else like to participate?
Hello? Hello?
Yes, Mr. Haberman. Yes, you may go ahead when you're ready.
Set my time in. My name is Eugene Haberman. A couple things. Before I forget, the next Assembly Committee meeting that's taking place after this committee meeting, I guess it's 12:40, called Legislative Committee, and that there is no website for that committee. So the public's blinded to what is the agenda, what is the information, and this is one of the committees, I guess, that you're having, but you don't have a website for it, or versus your committee, the homeless issue committee, there is a website, and the public can be more appropriately connected. Second is the resolution that was on your site today, dealing with a transition scenario, going from how you're going to go from having homeless occupy the Sullivan Arena and what's going to happen next. My concern is, most appropriately, is you need to have a discussion with the people. But when you put these resolutions, and I heard the words, it's going to be an addendum to the agenda on Friday, which means it's put on the agenda, and a lot of the stuff is in the beginning of the meeting, and there's no opportunity for the public to be able to be engaged in what's going on. And you're passing legislation dealing with proposed stuff, what the state legislature is doing, what you're doing, and there's no chance for the public to be engaged unless you sign up for initial audience participation and you're lucky enough to be heard, because it's a very limited amount of time in the beginning of the meeting. So this is not the way to do it. And there's been a lot of concerns on how the homeless issue is being handled, and you need to be more careful and respectful with the people, those who are tragically are homeless, and those who are concerned about the homeless, and those who are concerned about how it's being run. So I caution you, and I tell you, please stop this stuff where you put these resolutions out, addendums and so forth. And I've heard in response to when I've raised these concerns, well, the public can email us and text us and give us our communications about giving communications to what they're concerned. Well, the public is blinded to those communications, and this is not the way to operate. And I close with 24 seconds to spare, and thank you very much. And thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Would anybody else like to participate? Okay, seeing or hearing no one, any committee discussion? Okay. Not seeing any, I'm going to go ahead. I want to make a comment myself, and then we will move to adjournment. I'm sorry we didn't have the Healthy Spaces update. We'll get that, and we'll get that out to members, and hopefully maybe we can provide a written update on the committee's website. Similarly with rapid rehousing fund deployment, both of those are items of interest, not only to the members of the committee and members of the body, but also to the community, and we need to get those updates out as soon as possible. So if we are able to provide some kind of written update, I'll see if we can also distribute those updates via the listserv where the agenda goes out to those who have subscribed, so that we can disseminate that information as widely as possible. With that, that completes our agenda for today. So I will go ahead and adjourn today's meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.